about Imatinib.
Thank you, Kate. So I'm Jo Ewing. Welcome all. I treat patients with CML across the West Midlands and the Birmingham area. So these are a couple of the hospitals that I work at, and the bull is actually in the shopping centre, not at the hospital. And I'm going to talk to you about Imatinib. Imatinib, you'll see there, that's its chemical structure. So it's just a group of basically 4 different types of atoms: carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, and oxygen. And it's amazing that this has been an absolute game changer for people with CML. The majority of the people in this room with CML will have been treated with Imatinib at some time, and patients who are treated in the future are likely to experience Imatinib treatment. I'm going to talk a little bit about how it works, but this red structure here, sitting within that BCR-ABL protein that Kate has very eloquently told us about, that's how this Imatinib sits within that structure and turns those cells off and turns that cell proliferation off. The history is based on the discovery of that chromosome break, the translocation 922. But it took some time after that, and it was really in 1998 that this group here, including John Goldman, Professor Goldman in the UK, looked at taking the Imatinib structure into clinical trials. It was the first drug to be developed and targeted against a cancer driver protein. This is where it was announced in a Time magazine that this was the magic bullet. And this has led to improvements across a whole host of cancers, not just hematological cancers, but other targeted drugs that have followed on from Imatinib as that initial the initial ability to switch off cancer cells. So how it works, this is the 922 that gives rise to that BCR-ABL fusion protein. So you've got a little bit of BCR, doesn't normally stick to ABL, but there it is, and it's produced as a protein that then is a driver mutation on the surface of those myeloid cells and drives the myeloid leukemia cells. So Imatinib was developed, it sits into the pocket, it sits into that driver pocket and basically switches off that BCR-ABL. That's all well and good, and we get very good results, which I'll talk about. But some of the things that you'll hear later on, and some of the other drugs that you're on that are not Imatinib, were developed because this BCR-ABL fusion protein can develop these mutations that stops the Imatinib from sitting in that pocket. And so other drugs called the 2nd and 3rd generation tyrosine kinase inhibitors, or TKIs, were developed. So what they can do is they can bypass those mutations. They tend to be smaller and can still sit in the pocket, can still turn that BCR-ABL off. But Imatinib was that first one that was developed. Again, I'll talk about a patient. This is another patient in the USA, treated at the MD Anderson. But Mailman has been someone who has campaigned not only for CML but also for allogeneic transplant and looking for transplant donors. And he was treated on Imatinib 21 years ago. He was diagnosed a number of years before that, and this is what his memories were of being told the diagnosis, stage 37, back in 1995. So this puts into context what he was told and the difference that Imatinib's made. He said, "My doctor estimated I had just 3 years to live unless a donor could be found." He says, "I thought about my daughter who was just learning to ride the little pink bicycle Santa had left under the tree on Christmas morning." In 1998, having fought through lots of other treatments for his CML and heading towards being an extremely sick person, he was then treated on a trial at the MD Anderson onto what was then termed STI 571, which is now Imatinib. He's a 24-year survivor of CML. He's the person who's the longest survivor on those trials with his CML still on Imatinib. He's 61, and his daughter did learn to ride the bicycle, and She's now a doctor, and he's very proud of that. But he is there, and he's living with CML really well. So the outlook for CML in the context of having tyrosine kinase inhibitors available is, in majority of cases, absolutely excellent. It's a highly effective drug. Remissions are very stable. We now have all of those decades of safety evidence of Imatinib, and the safety and long-term safety of Imatinib is really very well established. It's possibly getting cheaper, and I'll talk a little bit about generics. Easier, possibly safer with generics. It's still feasible to stop Imatinib, so again you'll hear about stopping treatment after a number of years in a very deep remission, and that is still possible, although possibly slower to get to that time point. And stringent monitoring, so it's that taking the drug, adherence to the drug, and having that monitoring, having clinicians looking after you that really understand that monitoring, that is so critical. This is what we call a survival curve. So this is the original IRIS study that shows that the survival, this is cut at 8 years, it's 85% overall, but actually if you consider only those deaths that were related to the CML, the survival's 93% at 8 years after starting treatment. And that seems to continue to be stable. So it does mean that whilst only 10-year survival before the 70s was 5%, it increased a little bit with interferon. Now it's 84% and predicted to be probably around 90% by 2060 with the development of second and third generation TKIs and the impact of those. It means that there are more and more and more people out there with CML that are living with CML as a chronic disease. That means it's more prevalent, although the incidence remains about the same as Kate's alluded to, possibly a little bit lower, but the number of new cases that we see is around about the same each year, but the number of patients that are living with the CML and surviving to pretty much their normal life expectancy is increasing and increasing. So with a 66 million population in the UK, we now have around 10,000 cases of CML, but projected to be around 20,000 by 2040 and continuing to increase. And in 2011, Siddhartha Mukherjee, who wrote this fantastic book, The Emperor of All Maladies, he predicted that in 10 years from then, from 2011, each of us on average will know one person with chronic myeloid leukemia being kept alive by a targeted anti-cancer drug. So it is becoming something where people will know somebody with CML. The fact that it's a chronic disease, though, then puts us into another situation, which is that people are surviving with CML for many, many years. It's a chronic disease, but that means that the side effects of treatment over a long period of time, if patients are going to remain on treatment, has become an issue of really great importance. So looking at Imatinib, the side effects of Imatinib may be the thing that actually impacts on people's life rather than the CML itself. And I'll highlight some of these. Some skin issues, so you can get hypopigmentation. Some patients do experience a little bit of hair thinning. Weight gain is also a common thing, often because of fluid. Some patients develop more nausea and vomiting than others, and some patients get a lot of indigestion on Imatinib, so that can be a problem. We're looking at the kidneys and the liver, so they're important areas, but we tend to keep a check on those in the clinic through the clinic tests. And the other thing is the swelling around the eyes, what we call the periorbital edema. So there's bags or areas of fluid that develop under the eyes. And then the other key one is really the muscle cramps and arthralgia. So a lot of patients, particularly when they first start on Imatinib, develop these problems with joint problems. So the generic formulations, so to explain that there was an innovator compound produced by the company Novartis. The patent for that has now expired some years ago, and so many patients now are not started on that innovator compound. It's exactly the same Imatinib structure, but it's just packaged by different manufacturers. And you can find that the side effects are slightly different on different generics, which I'll go into. We get side effects because of this thing which is called off-target effects of tyrosine kinases. So you've got tyrosine kinases not just on your white blood cells, but on other areas of the body, so in the skin, in the gut. And so you get these side effects due to this off-target, although that has meant that Imatinib and other tyrosine kinases are used in other conditions. And so the off-target effects have actually been a positive in some cancers. This just summarises those very key, most common in practice side effects that patients get on Imatinib. So I've spoken about generic Imatinib. It's marketed, it's got the same brand name, so it's always called Imatinib. The dosage, the form, the safety, the strength are the same, but they've got different what we call excipients. So those things like cellulose, things that are used to package drugs may be slightly different and may contribute to different side effects. So here we have, this is the originator compound produced by Novartis, but these are some of the others that you may have noticed that you're getting from your own pharmacy. So there are far more than this that I couldn't put onto this slide. And I've certainly, in my experience, found that patients have got particular ones of these that perhaps upset them, that can upset their most particularly gastric symptoms. And that by switching and by having an excellent pharmacy and pharmacist that can source other suppliers for patients who make a clear record of which drugs and which manufacturers suit certain patients, we have managed to get our patients in the majority onto generic Imatinib. There's some patients who do move back onto the originator Novartis compound if they're really having a struggle with generic Imatinib. So there have been a number of studies to look at whether there are more side effects with generic Imatinib. This is a trial where 27 patients were switched from their innovator. You can see the percentage of patients, so this figure in brackets for each of those side effects there is the percentage of patients that had suffered from one of those side effects. So 63% had developed edema on Imatinib, 56% muscle cramps. Then when you look at the switch to generic Imatinib, whilst there seem to be fewer of these effects in terms of percentage terms, many patients switching from one to the other, indeed 39%, developed a worsening of or a change in their symptoms. Looking at effectiveness of the generics, this is looking at the effectiveness, and this is looking at sustained molecular response. You can see everybody retains sustained molecular response, and patients that had detectable BCR-ABL on the innovator before the switch, in all instances that either came down or stayed stable. So the safety and the efficacy of generic Imatinib is clearly not affected. There is a leaflet produced by CML Support looking at what generics are if you're interested to read about that. So no evidence that it's any way worse in terms of survival. Certainly we in the Midlands have a pathway to receive originator Imatinib if the switch is unsuccessful, and adherence remains the key factor to success, particularly at the very early stages of treatment. Taking Imatinib always with a large glass of water and swallowed whole. Precautions, obviously precautions in pregnancy, and so young patients will be warned about alerting the medical team if they plan to start to think about having a pregnancy well in advance of that. And there is the potential for weight gain. And over a long period of time, there does seem to be some alteration in the immune system with drugs like Imatinib, and some infections may become more prevalent over a long time. So some patients actually take a small break from Imatinib if they've got a good remission, if they start to develop infections. Interactions, I'm not going to read through all of these. I'll highlight a couple of the common things. So drugs such as warfarin And things like St John's wort, which are not prescribed but are picked up at health food shops, will interact with imatinib. Grapefruit juice should be avoided. Patients on thyroxine, which is quite a common thing, your doctor needs to know and have a look at the potential for that interaction. The aims are the same, whether you're on imatinib or any other tyrosine kinase inhibitor. And I know Jenny is going to go through the aims of treatment and how we measure that, but it's this big iceberg of CML that you start with, lots and lots of cells spilling out into the blood, giving that very high blood count. What we need to do is initially normalize that and then take it down to what we call molecular responses to give cells that you can't detect when you're looking at one cell in every 100, and then cells that you can't detect looking at 1 in every 1,000, and so on until you get a very deep response is what this is called, where the cells that are left are really those only at the very, very tip of that iceberg and start not to be detectable with the techniques that we have available to us. We look at different time points, so this is the 18-month time point. So some patients on imatinib actually respond really very, very rapidly. They're called super responders, and there has been some interest in why some patients are super responders, why they develop that very, very rapid response. And the whole genome sequencing of those patients is ongoing, and we may get some information as to why some people are super responders. But in general, it can take several months and even years to get the maximum response on imatinib. So it can be a slowly process. We do know, however, that patients who have a rapid response within the first 3 months, or a sort of reasonably rapid response, actually are more likely to achieve their time points. And so that 3-month assessment is really critical for patients on imatinib, so that we can look at which patients perhaps would benefit from a switch to an alternative. I've talked about imatinib being an amazing, fantastic drug, which it undoubtedly is. We do have to bear in mind that certainly in those original studies and other studies, that around 37% of patients don't get the outcome, the ideal outcome. And so what we'll talk to you about in the coming talks are what we call second and third generation drugs, to look at how we deal with patients if they do have too much toxicity on imatinib, or if their response is not as good as hoped for. Is always a complex issue. We have to define a number of features to determine what we think is the best treatment first line. We are looking at value, we're looking at whether speed of response is what's needed, or whether the safest in terms of side effects, a patient's quality of life on a drug, the ability to stop the drug. All of these will come into that initial discussion with your doctor as to what is that best first line approach. Is it still Mr. Incredible? I would say yes, but there are these others that have come along as the second generation and third generation TKIs. We try to match the drug with the patient's personal situation, and with the advent of generics, imatinib is favoured as first-line treatment. I've talked about the importance of 3-month time point monitoring. That's critical to allow switching, and monitoring those milestones. And that is everything that I have to say on imatinib, but obviously we'll be taking questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jo. So I'd now like to introduce